I'm going to leave it to John, my former colleague and good friend from the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Take it away, John.
I'm John Mecklin. I'm the editor-in-chief of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, and I'm lucky enough to have two people who I think, particularly for the reporters in the room, are going to be able to say some things that will spark ideas for new stories, new areas of inquiry, and just really interesting information. Tomas Statius here is a French investigative reporter for Lighthouse Reports. It's a nonprofit media organization that specializes in cross-border work. And in 2021, he published a year-long investigation into nuclear testing in French Polynesia. And on the other side of Tomas is Victoria Samson. She's the chief director for the Secure World Foundation, a nonprofit that promotes the sustainable use of space, which is increasingly becoming an area of contention among the major powers in the world. And I think I'm going to go to you first, Victoria, just because I like space. So over to you. You were going to talk a little bit about what your organization does and the dangers you see in space right now.
Sure, thank you. Hello, everyone. My name is Victoria Samson. I'm the Chief Director of Space Security and Stability for my organization, the Secure World Foundation. As was said, we're a nonprofit that focuses on the long-term sustainable use of outer space. We promote best practices and norms of behavior to make sure that space is accessible to and usable for all over the long term. So why is a space person talking at a nuclear conference? There has long been a history, a relationship between space and nuclear stability. And if you think about, again, going back to the part of the Cold War, where a lot of the nuclear arms control treaties had carve-outs where you would not interfere with national technical means, that is to say satellites, that do nuclear command and control, because the idea was if you were to interfere with them, it would be so destabilizing that it could actually lead to nuclear conflict or nuclear exchange. So that's still happening. That's still a concern. But I think kind of big picture, when you're looking at things that affect nuclear security and stability, space security and stability absolutely has an effect on that. One really shapes the other, just because space has become such a key national security enabler that it's really crucial for a lot of countries for their missions. And if they have any interference with that, particularly if the interference is being done by a nuclear rival, which is what we're seeing from the space rivals, that can lead, again, possibly, conflict in space could lead to conflict on Earth. And again, depending on who's involved in that, that could definitely be nuclear rivals. And when we're looking at issues with space security and stability, obviously we're talking about U.S., Russia, China. Those are the main ones, and I think the U.S. and Chinese relationship is a complicated one anyways. Earlier, we heard a lot of discussion about China's nuclear arsenal. So that's something that you have concerns about, particularly when you have activities that are happening on orbit that are unclear in terms of what's considered responsible behavior. For example, the U.S., Russia, and China, they all, everyone does what they call uncoordinated close approaches, where they do close approach to other countries' satellites without their approval or acceptance. And they can be doing this for several reasons. They can be doing this to spy. They can be doing this to jam. They can be doing this to show that they can. At some point, there's a possibility they could be doing it to release objects at high velocity, that is to say some sort of kinetic weapon. It's unclear. And so it's really destabilizing and really uncertain what the intention is. So much of space capabilities, it's not necessarily the technology, it's the intent. And so when you're trying to figure out how do you demonstrate good intent when you're having these activities between nuclear rivals, you can see that can be very destabilizing very quickly. As well, one of the issues that we're seeing in terms of space security and stability is that Russia is a fading power when it comes to space. Now, I grew up learning that the U.S. won the Cold War, and that we beat the Russians to the moon, and therefore we won the space race. And then I started working on space issues. I'm like, oh, actually, the Soviets had the first satellite in space. They had the first man in space. They had the first woman in space. They had the first spacewalk. Basically, the only thing the U.S. beat them at was getting a person to the moon. So he asked for that one. But I mean, Russia has always been, really a strong space power until recently. They have had a lot of corruption issues. They've had a lot of quality control issues. Even before Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, before that, fall of 2021, there was a law passed that said that Russian citizens could not talk to foreigners about their space program. That's not a space program that's doing well. All right. So Russia also doesn't have a commercial space program. That's kind of historical legacy. Didn't really, believe in the private sector for a long time. So that's part of that. Where Russia is still a geopolitical superpower is its military space capabilities. And so for me, that's a concern, because if they want to demonstrate their leadership, that's a good way for them to do that. And we see that happening right now. Actually, there are news stories released earlier this year that U.S. intelligence officials believe that Russia has been working on a nuclear warhead that could be used to detonate in space as an anti-satellite weapon. No one has that right now. No one's done that. That is against the international legal regime in space. There's a few treaties, but the biggest one is the Outer Space Treaty. And it's very clear in this Article 4 of that says you may not place weapons of mass destruction in orbit or on the moon or other celestial bodies. Russia was one of the key, or I should say the Soviet Union was one of the key sponsors of the Outer Space Treaty negotiators. They've signed it. So, the question is, first of all, what started all that? Supposedly, there's a satellite at about 2,100 kilometers, which is at the very edge of what's considered low Earth orbit in an area of very high radiation that was launched by the Russians. When they launched it, they said that they were doing it to test how satellites held up in radiation. Radiation can be very harmful for satellites, can affect their electrical systems. Why would you develop a weapon of mass destruction to be used, or to be specific, a nuclear warhead, to be used as an anti-satellite weapon? They're very crude, but they're very effective. What happens when you detonate a nuclear warhead in space? We know, because the U.S. and the Soviet Union did that in the first 4 or so years after Sputnik. So there's it's like a two-tier sort of thing. First tier is when the nuclear weapon explodes. Any satellite is when the line of sight is going to be affected by it. Probably its electrical systems are going to be ruined. It's become a dead rock floating in space. But second tier, that's more concerning. When there's a nuclear explosion, it releases an amount of radiation and electromagnetic pulse. And this radiation is captured by the Earth's magnetic field, specifically some of these fields that are high radiation anyways. Satellites are meant to withstand a certain amount of radiation because space is radiation, and that's just part of how you have to deal with it. But the more you go through these active radiation fields, and if there's more radiation than there should be normally, the satellites are going to die a lot quicker. And so what we've seen is, for example, in July 1962, with the U.S. Starfish Prime nuclear explosion in space, that was done, it was a pretty big warhead. It was a 1.4 megaton warhead that was released at an altitude of about 400 kilometers in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. It took out about a third of the active satellites at that point. Of course, this is 5 years after Sputnik, so we're talking about 6 satellites, but still. And it, about 1,400 kilometers away, it took out streetlights in Hawaii. When the Soviets did something similar, not quite as big a nuclear warhead, but a lower altitude, they actually managed to blow up some power stations because of the electrical charges. So we know it's going to happen. And, so, based on calculations, the idea, just depending on how big the warhead is and at the altitude and latitude and what the Earth's magnetic fields are doing at that point, you could see most of the amount of radiation, the extra radiation that's in low Earth orbit, which is where most satellites are, would take the better part of a year, about 300 days to dissipate. If it's at a higher altitude, at geostationary orbit, which is where the nuclear command and control satellites are, it would take about 30 days. So that's a concern. So if you were to have a nuclear, you can't say, okay, we have an explosion in space, I'm only going to target my rival. No, you're going to take out everyone's satellites in the area. But if you want to do it, you can. And so that's really the concern here, is that if they're working on this sort of thing, thinking that, if they want to affect U.S. capabilities, that could have consequences for everyone. And just to wrap up, because I know I'm pretty much on my time, a lot of people who talk about space security issues don't realize that everyone on this planet is a user of space data in some way, shape, or form. Everyone will be affected by this. It's not just companies have satellites, not just countries that have satellites, not even countries that have space programs. It's everyone. And so this is a real concern just for overall security and stability. Thanks.
Hey, thanks a lot, Victoria. That's you've probably scared about half the audience halfway to death. So now we'll move over to French Polynesia. I'm really interested, Tomas, to hear, first of all, how you got into that kind of investigation and what what did you find as you went through it?
Hey everyone, my name is Tomas. I'm the other Frenchman in the room. We are a pair with Sebastian. So, as you said, John, so first off, I want just to say that I work for an organization called Lighthouse Reports. What John presented is true. We're a cross-border investigative outlet. What I want to say is we're not a publisher ourselves. We publish mainly with media outlets we partner with. We already partner probably with some of you guys. We work with WAPO, with Bloomberg, and really looking forward to work with others. So please reach out. As John said, like my journey, let's say, in like looking at nuclear stories started like 3 years ago with a set of like declassified documents that were declassified by the French military in 2013. And essentially those documents told the story of like the nuclear testing in French Polynesia. And from those who do not know and not really familiar with that story, from 1966 to 1996, essentially the French military blew more than 200 bombs in Algeria and then in Polynesia. Some of those were atmospheric tests, some of those were underground tests. And what we've done with Sebastian at Princeton University, we published a report on the outcome of the testing, the consequences. And the main conclusion per se was that close to 100,000 people were contaminated by the fallout of the test, which opened a huge pathway for compensation, essentially, because the French state opened a compensation law in 2010. And the numbers that Sebastian put out in this academic piece that he published basically opened the route for like probably 10,000 people to be compensated. So it's a huge impact. It led Emmanuel Macron, our dear president, to go to Polynesia Island to apologize, and also to a massive declassification of documents. Close to 200,000 documents were declassified after our report. So it was like a big journey. What I wanted to talk to you guys today is, so this was Polynesia 3 years ago. You can check the website. It's called morafiles.org. There was a book also published. The book is named Toxic, as the song by Britney Spears. And unfortunately, it's only in French now. So if you know a publisher, like, come to say hi. No, what I wanted to talk to you guys today is another subject that I've been quite interested in for the past months. And actually, it's interesting to talk about such a room of like colleagues and scholars and so on. I want to talk about a constant absent, I think, in the nuclear reporting world, something that's kind of in the back of the story of everyone but never really reported, is mining. I feel like in most of the presentation that we talk this morning, we talk about weapons, we talk about nuclear fuel, etc., but we never really talk about mining. And mining, if you're looking, and a lot of the discussion we have were like prospective, like what could happen if, what will happen if, and how many casualties are we looking at this scenario and so on. But I want to say that the first victim of the nuclear arms race is actually all the miners, the downwinders, of course, and as the people put it, the veterans, like close to the ICBM. But they're also the miners. And most of those miners, as it stands right now, are in non-Western countries, and they are in a situation where they are very exposed to radiation and also contamination. So in the one-pager that I hand to Rob, and thank you for the invitation actually to present here, is so great. I gave a couple of examples of stories that I think are not looked enough. So maybe I will go quickly through those, and maybe we can have a discussion afterwards. So I divided those stories, let's say, in 3 groups. I mean, that's my division. Maybe you will feel like one story fill in another category and so on. And all those stories imply, I would say, mixed methodology. So it will mean like community reporting and underground reporting. It will need also some archival works. I think like investigative journalism, journalists often like do not look enough at archive. A lot of stuff can be found in archive, whether it's in the US, whether it's in France, whether it's in companies and so on. So. And the last bit of methodology is, of course, mixed methodology, like open source intelligence, and stuff you can do with scholars as good as Sebastian, who was on the stand before I speak. So the first set of stories I think of is, genealogy, right? For instance, in France, until the 1990s, you probably do not know, we had a very strong uranium mining program. Close to more than 200 uranium mines were opened in France, which is a lot. They were opened by the state, and the state exploited those until essentially like it was outsourced to other countries that we'll talk about after. And those mines, it's a fading memory. And there was a piece by Le Monde that I share in the binders that said that like there's hardly any signs of it, any signs of its existence, and the only memory that you have is the people that live essentially the time of the extraction. And there has been some litigation process against the mine and those consequences, but those never really came through. And I think that's a good example of like archival work that you can do. You can look at the mine and so on. And this could apply also to other sites, because as I said, the French don't, of course I have a French bias, right? You will see that. The French did not only extract uranium in France, they extract also uranium in Gabon. They extract uranium in Madagascar. They extract uranium in Niger up until now. And if I refer to a great book of nuclear studies by someone called Gabrielle Escht, called Being Nuclear, she's used a lot of that archival, essentially, that you can find in all those places in France to tell the untold story of the contamination of the mine and so on. And some of those cases are still pending. So that's the first kind of story I think could be interesting to have a look as an investigative reporter. The second set of stories I think are interesting in those like where you can find power nodes essentially, and to tell essentially the whole story of the nuclear proliferation that we're talking about, but apply to the uranium supply chain, like where are the node of powers, who control this supply chain and so on. And a really interesting place to look at, I think, and I'm amazed that there's not a lot of reporting on at the moment, is Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is the world leading uranium essentially extraction site. How the Kazakhs do it usually is to create joint ventures with foreign companies, so with the Chinese, for instance, with France, with the mining giant called Orano, previously called Areva, with also some other countries. And there are hardly no reporting on Kazakhstan at the moment. No reporting about the contamination. Here, the mining is not open pit mine, it's what they call in situ leaching. So basically, it's pulling sulfuric acid into the ground and pumping the uranium back, which is of course very dangerous for like water supply and so on. And as I said, hardly no journalism like looking at that. So I think that's a second set of story that I think could be interesting that is not looked enough, in my opinion. And of course, the last kind of stories are contamination story, right? I mean, there are some pending cases. In a French context, there is an open case against Orano Areva in Niger, where miners brought a case in front of ECOWAS Chamber of Justice, essentially, for contamination of their house, because that's a big tradition in the mining sector to essentially build the house with what was pulled out of the mine and not use, of course. But guess what? Like some of those rocks were radioactive, so the miners like took a lot of radioactivity on it. And recently, like I found another very interesting example is like in Namibia, right? Namibia is the third producer of uranium. And there you have two competing programs, one run by the Chinese, the other one by Rosatom. And here you have like big suspicion of contamination of the water due to like the in situ leaching, let's say, operation that they are pulling out. So yeah, those are the three stories I think could be told. Of course, there are many more that I think we can have a look at. And yeah, this is essentially what I had to say. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Tomas. I'm going to put Victoria on the spot a little bit. We didn't pre-plan our questions here, but I mean, uncovered stories in the military space realm, things you think deserve more coverage and aren't being covered. I mean, essentially, I see very little coverage at all of space as the kind of danger you described. But anything specific you think somebody could jump on right away?
Well, so for one of the major publications my organization puts out that I'm a co-editor of is our Global Counterspace Threat Assessment. That's an unclassified look at counterspace capabilities amongst 12 different countries over the course of 5 different categories. We include the United States in that as well. Many, when they're talking about counterspace capabilities, at least here in the United States, they do not. And when I say counterspace, that just means anything that can interfere with any part of the space system. So things like anti-satellite weapons, things like close approaches, which we call co-orbital, directed energy, the nuclear weapon thing I talked about earlier, jamming, and then finally cybersecurity type stuff. So, I mean, one of the things that really strikes me for that is that just, there's a real proliferation of countries starting to say that, okay, they want to develop counter space capabilities because, space is a dangerous place and they want to be able to protect their assets. And I understand the need for national security considerations for space. I understand the need to have defensive measures. But one of the things that have never struck me when, countries say we need to develop these anti-satellite weapons, and these are the kind of direct ascent. So the idea that you have an interceptor that's terrestrially launched either from the ground or air or sea to intercept and directly impact a satellite and to run into it to destroy it. When they say they're developing this kind of programs because they want to protect their satellites, I'm like, how? How does that protect your satellite, the ability to hit other countries' satellites? It doesn't make sense. Particularly if the country that you're worried about doesn't particularly have a lot of satellites. I'm looking at India and Pakistan in that case. Or if it's, the idea that you yourself depend so heavily on satellites that you don't want to deliberately create debris in orbit, which is what, if you destroy a satellite in orbit, it's going to have pieces of debris. Right now, we don't have any way in which to get rid of that debris. That debris is up there until the Earth pulls it back down. Until that point, you have to dodge it. That's the debris you can see. If the pieces of debris are too small to track, they could still be dangerous when you're moving at 17,000 miles an hour. Even a paint chip, the size of a paint chip, can be very dangerous. So that's the one. I've never really had any reporter really drill down like how does this help protect you, other than you just want to have something the other countries have. And space often that's been a matter of national prestige, so I understand that. But if you're really concerned about the security and stability of your space systems, I just don't see how that helps you out.
Okay, I'm going to ask you one more question, and then you all need to start getting your questions ready because we're going to have a little longer Q&A from you folks for this. But I was just wondered what you think about Elon Musk and Starlink, and he controls so much of the U.S. space lift capacity.
How much time do I have on that one? All right, so just to set the stage, there are about right now 10,800 active satellites, of which I want to say the United States has about 7,100. Might be off on that. Of that 7,000 plus, Starlink is about 6,000. So Starlink is a huge percentage of the U.S. Satellites. Starlink just started getting launched 5 years ago. And so it's really, for me, it's been amazing to see just the real shift in terms of numbers, where space used to be a domain that was primarily dominated by nation states to one that's dominated not even just by the commercial sector, but by one entity in the commercial sector. Starlink is being launched with the idea it's providing space-based internet for parts of the world that don't get it otherwise. So I think that it's a really positive, goal. The question is, how are they going about doing it? The altitude they're at about 550 kilometers. I mean, the plan is eventually maybe 45,000 satellites. It's unclear. But other companies and countries are trying to put together these very large constellations as well. And, the Chinese just started launching one, but theirs only has like 40. But if you look at it, they want to have one that's like 13,000 satellites and one that's 15,000. The Germans want to do one that's 10,000. Rwanda put in a request with the International Telecommunications Union for a constellation of like 330,000 satellites. I think Rwanda has one or two active satellites at this point. Clearly, we're looking at a spectrum grab. So I think that's the concern is that SpaceX may have inadvertently created this this race to grab spectrum, where everyone's launching satellites, hoping that, or they want to launch satellites. And right now, SpaceX is the only one that's done that. On the other side, SpaceX is one of the few launchers for the U.S. space industry, and that's for the global space industry. The Falcon 9 launch vehicle that SpaceX has, it had some issues over the summer and the technical issues, and so they had to hold off on launching until they could figure out what was going wrong, and that just basically stopped launching for a while. And it just set back all these satellites plans, and not just for U.S. companies, for Indian companies, for companies all over the world. And so for me, that's a concern as well that we have that. The Space Force just did a competition where they wanted to promote more launch vehicle companies because they want to have a competition. And they said, okay, we need someone to be able to do a launch by the end of 2025, and we want new launch companies to get involved and do this. Guess who got the first contract? SpaceX. He said, well, they're the only ones who can do it. I'm like, well, guys, it's not the point. You're trying to, develop this sort of thing. So I have concerns about that. And then just in general, I have serious concerns about the role Elon Musk is playing in the new administration. His Department of Government Efficiency. At first, to be honest, I thought that was just kind of putting him at the kids' table with the idea that we're going to put him off somewhere we can't do any damage. However, a lot of the recommendations, it seems that the person who's going to be suggested to be appointed to the OMB, he has said that he's going to enact a lot of their recommendations. And those recommendations, they can be very damaging to a lot of the entities that are involved. And then finally, I'm concerned that Elon Musk is involved to get rid of a lot of the reporting requirements, the environmental impact statements, that sort of thing, the restrictions for launching. And some of that, I think I'm always happy for a light regulatory touch. That's the U.S. mantra. But they're going to do this at the cost of safety for people in the area. Are they going to do this at the cost of, competitors to SpaceX? So I just a lot of question marks all around.
Okay, thanks, Victoria. Tomas, I'm going to ask you a very general question. I'm not sure you're going to have an answer to this, but in terms of, that project you got into Polynesia, it sounds like, gosh, this is kind of a reporter's dream. We've got some young journalists here. Any advice for young journalists who are interested in the nuclear sort of field? How do you get in there and figure out some way to get the support to do something substantive like that?
How to do that? Yeah, I don't know. I mean, it was a lot of work. I had the chance also. I think the chance that the project had, like especially in French Polynesia, is to have this double, let's say, this bi-disciplinary. No, it was more than 2 disciplines actually. It was 3 disciplines because we had help of like some folks doing forensic analysis and reconstruction. Some of those were part of a group that you may or may not know called Forensic Architecture out of in London doing like reconstruction and so on. I think the fact that Sebastian and I essentially do not have the same discipline background help like each other reporting essentially. So Seb will bring to the table a lot of like material. So I was a fast track learner, let's say in the nuclear world, because essentially he did send me like probably more than 20 PDF per day. And on the on the other side, I think what helped him, but that's more a question for him actually, is I think asking different questions than the ones you'd be asking as a scholar, right? Asking narratives question, how do you write the story? How do you tell it? And also, I think the story also had the chance where we have we managed to make it an actual story, even though it was something that happened in the past. So my advice would be to young reporter, choose a sidekick or a couple of partners to work with, because it's important, because it's a job that's so challenging. And at the time also, I had the chance to work with an outlet that gave space, essentially. It was more than 1 year, actually. It was probably close to 2 years work, essentially. So pick, not wait to be picked by an outlet. Pick the outlet you want to work with, essentially. So yeah, that would be my 2 advice, yeah.
Okay, thanks, Tomas. I'm going to command the mic for a really short time here. This is supposed to be, a presentation about how do you find stories in the nuclear space? What are news stories? What are things you could do that aren't being done? And I just had a couple of ideas because I've been the editor of the Bulletin for 13 or 14 years now, and there are a few things. I think in general, the intersection of existential risks is an area that is greatly undercovered because it's complicated. Nuclear and climate are obviously tied together in some ways. Artificial intelligence and military affairs, particularly nuclear affairs, are clearly tied together. So that stories, climate change and public health. Diseases move around and new ones emerge as the climate changes. So there's a whole bunch of stories to do that involve not just nuclear, but connect to nuclear. So if you're interested in the nuclear sector and you want news stories, you might look at, well, how does that intersect with other major global threats? And the other area that I'd suggest before we go to your questions is there's been, mentioned today here a lot about nuclear power, being expanded quickly to deal with climate change, to deal with AI's energy needs and whatever. And the press in general has done a really remarkably poor job of pointing out the negative aspects of the idea of tripling nuclear power capacity by 2030 or 2035, that, the COP process, they've actually got all these countries agreeing to do that. Practically speaking, it's essentially impossible. But outside of that, the other associated risks are barely even mentioned, and they need to be. And there's stories there about, yes, waste, but the proliferation thing is often talked about in mumbo jumbo, in using the term proliferation risk or non-proliferation or whatever. You spread nuclear power plants all around the world, more and more and more, and some country is going to separate out fissile material or enrich uranium to high enough level, and it'll get diverted. There will be more nuclear weapons. And that's a real danger that's almost never talked about in plain language. And those are stories waiting to do. Okay, I've given myself my 3 minutes, and that's enough for me. I think it's time for your questions. Does anybody have some? Right there. And I'm sorry, I wish I knew names, but I don't,
Thank you, Linda Pence-Gunter from Beyond Nuclear, and thank you, John, for mentioning that. We'll be in touch about that for sure. And also, thank you, Tomas, for talking about the human faces. I was interested to know, since it sounds like you're an aggregation site, so you compile stories from existing news outlets, right? Mostly. I'm interested to know what kind of response you have to stories that do put the human face on this versus the more arcane types of articles that do talk about the technology or the policy aspects or so forth, but forget to put the human face on. And it was good that you mentioned uranium mining. I've been to a site in France of an abandoned uranium mine. You're right, it looks like some pastoral place to have a picnic, and in fact that's what happens there, and no one knows where the hot spots are. So I'd be very interested to know, how we generate more stories that tell it from that perspective of to whom it happens as opposed to what it's about.
No, I'm not an aggregator, actually. I'm just opening you. Basically, what I did is opening to you my report, a notebook with a couple of ideas I have. Those are leads that I haven't worked on, but I feel interesting to me. So I'm an investigative journalist. Those are stories that would be interesting to work on. Essentially, that I start working on a little bit. But to address your question of how can we do so, and whether it will draw more impact, I think it will draw more impact, essentially. And that's something we try to do at Lighthouse Reports, is we try to partner with outlets from very global partners to very local ones, essentially. So, for instance, to give you an example that's not nuclear related, last year I worked on a story with Bloomberg on one side, so, and the other side, the small media outlet in Congo DRC called Actualité.cd, and it was about the lack of ID card in Congo. So believe it or not, like Congolese citizens did not have an ID card for the last 50 years, essentially, and it's kind of problematic. And to draw a lot of impact and so on, we decided, and that's something we do at Lighthouse all the time, to have one global partner to work with who has resources, you know, like that can help and so on in the reporting. And on the other side, the publication that the people actually read, because of course, you know, spoiler alert, no one reads Bloomberg in Congo DRC. I mean, it's in English, it's behind paywall, you know, like, so that's what we do. And I think, how do we do stories? I think, like, educate journalists to do those stories. I mean, those stories are out there. I mean, as you said, you can walk by a nuclear mine in France and ask probably the people around, like, what the legacy of that mine looked like. I mean, it's not as it was, you know, totally out of reach, right? It's something we could do, yeah.
Okay, thanks for that question. I see hands, and I see a microphone going to a hand. But please introduce yourselves first so we know who you are.
Nell Shrina, thanks, Dick Media. Thank you both for this wonderful conversation. This is another question for Tomas, but it seems like from the COP goal of tripling nuclear energy, there is an unquestioned logic of growth that kind of the industrial countries are sticking to as we come up with solutions for navigating climate change. But one thing isn't being addressed, and this is kind of similar to previous questions, but that's the human element of who is doing this resource extraction, what are they earning, what conditions are they living under, what is the political development of their nations like. And alongside that is when we tell stories about communities who are, or nations who are formerly colonized or kind of relegated to these extraction economies, they're stuck in a perpetual state of victimhood, or at least that's the story that is told. So I'm wondering if you have any reflections on how to tell stories about people who are suffering the brunt of these toxic, radioactive extraction economies in a way that positions them as leaders, as lessons for our global economy and our global transition.
I think it's to never evade the complexity of the situation, right? I mean, what you said make me think of like the situation in Namibia, right? And that's coming back to that classic Being Nuclear, the book by Gabrielle Hedge. She tell at the time, before the independence of Namibia, there was this big mine called Rossing, right? It's one of the main uranium mines. It's still being exploited today. And at the time, the independence, essentially fighters from SWAPO, which was the party that's still in power, were not in favor of the closing of the mines, beyond like all the advocacy work by people from Greenpeace, for instance, telling them like, you should close the mine because it's dangerous. They were like, no, we don't want to close the mine because it's our livelihood. Like, we need that money and so on. So I think I do not have any definitive recipe to that. I think to apply like the methodology we have, to have a diverse team, to have someone who know on the ground, to try to avoid extractive practice on the ground, like working with local outlets, and also not drive the narrative, you know. Let people say what they want to say. In some sense, it will be like nuclear power plant is shit, like we want it done. And in other means, it will be this bring, you know, money to us, and we need that. But what we need is like more like security, more protection gears, and so on. So that will be my advice. But again, like it's a complex bargain, and I think it's a complex bargain for anyone that works on cross-border investigation. It applied to this story, but it applied to any story. And I agree, like the victimization side of things is very annoying. So I hope I answered your question. Yeah.
Yeah, it is a great question, too, and I would only add, we'll find editors that don't want to play into that. Take your stories to editors who want to tell what's really going on.
Hi, my name is Jacob. I'm from Outrider. I want to ask a bit more about Musk, because you're basically saying he controls a lot of national security infrastructure, basically, and there's been reporting of his role like in Ukraine, and I wonder how's the interaction between like SpaceX controlled versus like National Security Administration control of this infrastructure, and if you could speak to that, and like do they take over some of the management of this, or how does it work?
I mean, SpaceX is a private company, so they control their own stuff. Where the connection is with the U.S. national security establishment is that they have contracts. And so they have contracts to launch satellites for the U.S. national security infrastructure, and these are intel satellites and military satellites. And then they have contracts to launch astronauts to the space station. That's how the U.S. gets people to the space station. So that's a connection there. And I think that the U.S. national security infrastructure depends very heavily on SpaceX following through on those contracts. When they turned off Starlink in Ukraine, that was at a point where, frankly, no one was paying for Starlink in Ukraine. Musk started doing it when Russia invaded Ukraine in February 2022, and then just did it for free. And then when he, started at a point where he thought, oh, this could actually lead to something, Russia threatened to go nuclear. And he said, okay, well, we're just going to turn it off in certain areas. He wasn't getting paid for it, and I love to criticize Musk as long as the next person, but, I have to have sympathy for that one. But now that he's being paid for it, he has to fulfill the obligations for that. The concerns you have is that the edges of the war can be foggy. And so there have been reports now of Russian soldiers using Starlink to communicate because they're in areas that had previously been held by Ukrainian soldiers. And it's just, you can't, they don't want to turn it off because, the Ukrainians need it. So hot tip, it's complicated.
Yeah. How much time do we have, Tom? Yeah, but one more question and then we'll turn it.
Yeah, on the Musk front. So this Doge, or whatever they're going to call it, is this going to be subject to Office of Government Ethics disclosures, like financial disclosures and things? Because part of me was thinking the sky is falling. This weirdo is about to be in control of some really important stuff. Another part of me thought all of a sudden we might have windows into his conflicts of interest that we didn't before. So when someone like a Musk moves into the government arena, tell me about the opportunities that opens up for us on a reporting front from a, technical point of view, the windows we have into someone's life once they step into government life that they didn't as a private citizen.
We're over, so I'm going to keep this short. Maybe we can talk about it more in the break. But I would like to emphasize that this is not business as usual with the Trump 47 administration. So all of those things that should be doing, I don't know that they're going to do them.
Now, plus, I'd note that Elon is not actually a government employee, so what kind of reporting he might have to do is greatly open to question, but he does know how to use power. And I want to thank all of you. You're a wonderful audience. I loved all the questions, and thanks so much.